Hello there, it's Dan here, and before you listen to this final episode of Series 2 featuring Dan Glass, just a reminder to please keep subscribed to the podcast, as throughout April and May there are additional bonus episodes coming on through before the new series begins in June. And this includes a 5-part compilation special across every Friday in May, featuring some of the highlights from Series 1 and 2. Now then, enjoy this episode with the wonderful Dan Glass. Welcome to HIV The Morning After. I'm Dan Hall. I'm a documentary producer and director. I've spent my entire adult life watching ignorance and prejudice play out around HIV, and frankly, I'm tired of it, and I'm sure many of you are too. This podcast is an attempt to do something about that, not through lectures or statistics, but by doing what I do best, interviewing people and letting them tell their own stories. Real voices, lived experiences, no bullshit. These conversations matter, and if you think so too, please rate, review, and share HIV The Morning After. I can make these episodes, but I can't make people listen to them or find them on their algorithms. That bit's down to you. You can reach me at hivthemorningafter@gmail.com. Right then, let's get started. Today I'm speaking with Dan Glass, activist, author, and according to Nigel Farage, scum. Born in 1983, the year HIV was first identified as HIV rather than the gay plague, Dan grew up under Thatcher's Section 28, with only EastEnders Mark Fowler and Tombstone adverts for reference. Diagnosed in their early 20s, Dan initially refused treatment until their CD4 count crashed so severely that they developed AIDS. Since then, Dan has reformed ACT UP London, helped with PrEP access through spectacular performance activism, written 2 books on queer radical history, co-founded Bender Defenders, a queer self-defense training, created the annual Fuck Off This Is My Culture protest party, and is about to open London's first community-run LGBTQ+ space at the Joiners Arms in East London. Just last week, Dan organised a die-in Trafalgar Square on World AIDS Day, because as it turns out, the fight isn't over, not by a long shot. Dan, it's brilliant to have you here.
Oh, it's so good to have you here. Thanks so much for the introductions. I've got some things to say about all of them.
You were born in 1983, the year that HIV was first recognised as HIV. What did it mean to you growing up in Thatcher's Britain under Section 28?
Death. It just meant death and isolation and internalised stigma, and that it's your own fault. And it was just savage. And when you mentioned Mark Fowler, I still love you, Todd Carty. You actually were such a salvation for me, even though it was really miserable seeing you get on your motorbike and leave the square on your own. That was my only frame of reference. It was deeply lonely. It was deeply scary. And I just didn't have a Danny LaRue about what it actually meant, let alone on a scientific level. I just knew that it meant death, really, because that was at the heart of the height of the crisis, really, the 80s and 90s. I didn't have any friends. I didn't know any friends who were HIV positive, and really that time any queer friends either. So I didn't really have any kind of ropes to hang on to.
And in the absence of any other knowledge, these cultural references such as EastEnders, Mark Fowler, or the Tombstones, they're kind of all we've got.
Yeah, and they are really important, and it really makes me realise how important the work that you do and the work that we all do to give a different perspective, to give a different message, to put alternative stories out in the mainstream public imagination through film, through art, through protest, through books, everything. Like, part of our purpose in life as people living with HIV, queer people, any marginalised people, is to tell our own stories, because the state, the establishment aren't going to do it.
So what do you think was missing from those messages? What was young Dan Glass not getting?
And I think the main things that were missing was really like when you zoom out, the brilliance of our community, because we weren't told about the actual true human stories of everyone who should be here who isn't. And every single person has a huge wealth of creativity, of characteristics, of a whole personality, not just a statistic. And really, all it was statistics. For so many people, it's not just school or libraries or public institutions where homosexuality or healthcare or any marginalization was banned. You know, for many of us, we grow up with multiple levels of silencing, and I grew up in a religious and conservative environment where being gay was an abomination, and another culture of silence. And as the main thread that I see throughout my spark, which has sparked me to become active and activist, is challenging silence. You know, and that's why the pink triangle, silence equals death, is at my core. Challenging silence and stigma is everything. And the more I think about it, you know, I was thinking a lot about it this World AIDS Day. I was thinking, who of my friends, my straight friends, for example, I'm very lucky to have a good friendship circle, which I've had to cultivate because of the loneliness at the beginning. You know, who was saying, Dan, I'm thinking of you today. Well done on that action. It's very easy for people to be comfortable in their domination. Not that they're evil, not that they're lazy. It's just cultures of silence rely upon people not understanding the lived realities of marginalized people. I had what you have what's called seroconversion, when HIV kind of attacks your system, and it's a real bad, what seems like the flu. And I was at home, and I was thinking, this is not just the flu, something's going on here. I went to my doctors in Brighton, Dr. Seaton, wherever you are, thank you very much. And he said those words, the three letters HIV. And it struck me so deep in my soul. And I didn't know anything about the scientific reality, the health reality, what it means on a social level. For me, it just meant death. And then, you know, I was like, but what does it mean in terms of sex? What does it mean in terms of blowjobs? What does it mean in terms of this position? And he was like, you know, Dan, there is more to it than sex. There is more to it than blowjobs. And I was like, oh, right, okay. And then he started talking in at that time what was the alien language to me, which was CD4 count, viral load, and it was just an absolute blizzard. And I was literally just like, it was cognitive dissonance listening to him, thinking back to Mark Fowler, thinking back to the tombstones. And I got really drunk, went to my mate Jess's house, and it was just a crying mess. And she actually helped me go to the toilet, and I think I weed on her. So yeah, sorry about that, Jess. It was, for the first couple of days, couple of weeks, an absolute blizzard of like how to deal with it. But I had to go to work. And I remember saying to my boss, I had to like compartmentalize it really quickly. And I said, oh yeah, sorry about that. It turned out it weren't flu. I've got HIV. And he sat me down. He was like, Dan, this is a big deal. Bless him, Paul Newton, thank you. He was really good. He was really good. He was like, Dan, you need to take the time that you need. Take time off work. He was a bit older. He was my boss, right? And he obviously had been through the social realities of HIV. And he really helped me support me to sit down and have the space to deal with it at the beginning. It was really emotionally exhausting, telling friends one by one, and you know, being there for their reactions. Some of them good, some of them not so great. I was like, I'm just going to do it all at once. My HIV coming out show was in 2012. It was called Shafted. My mate helped me come up with a concept. which was based on Stars in Their Eyes. We booked a church hall out in Glasgow, and it was on the 25th anniversary of ACT UP, and we paid tribute to them. In the show, we had clips of some of their actions on the screen. I had different friends who were helping do little bits of performances amongst the monologues of my story. And at the end of it, the kind of climax, we made a giant 12-foot cock-shaped human cannon, which I went inside and got flung across the audience, because that was the show was called Shafted. Are we shafted? And what are we coming out of? And obviously I got HIV through a dick. And instead of being like, tonight, Matthew, I'm going to be Kylie, I said to the audience, and tonight, everyone, I'm living with HIV. And so that was my kind of like self-deprecating ridiculous way of coming out. It was such a soul-lifting experience.
Now then, Dan, you tested positive at a time when effective medication was available, and yet for years you refused to take it. Yeah. Why was that?
Yeah. One thing we always say in the movement is it's that living with HIV or treatment or living a good life with HIV is much more than pills into bodies. So yes, there was antiretrovirals, but it's all about housing, healthcare, support, whether you look through like the normative lens of family or education or having any avenues for understanding or critical consciousness. So I had so much fear and so much internalized stigma, and obviously the conditioning that I was just going to die. And I wasn't from a culture, not that I blame them now, I've done a lot of kind of work on it, of empowerment or hope. The gravity of Section 28 was so lethal that it's your fault, that you're wrong, that whatever happens to you, you're doomed. And so I didn't take medication for about 5 years, until my doctor really made me. At the time, I was living in Glasgow and I was about to move to Berlin, and I got shingles in Glasgow, which my nurses in Glasgow, bless them, they were so amazing. We're like, Dan, this is the red roses from hell. This is a real sign that your immune system is in a real bad way. And obviously, like, there's a direct correlation between stress and your immune system. And I used to notice the more I was stressed, the more sick I got. I got white things on my tongue. I had red rashes all up my arm, which was a sign that my immune system was in a really bad place. I was so rigid with fear, and that I've just got to deal with it on my own. And I think that's another pathology of Section 28 is hyper-individualism. Because living under Thatcher, where there's no such thing as society and it's your fault, and no one's going to support you, so many of us have grown up, have had to just bring ourselves up, have had to parent ourselves, because we're told that we're the wrong ones.
In den Schatten der Stadt, wo das Schweigen regiert, habe ich mich oft für mein Sehnen geniert. Doch die Scham ist ein Käfig aus Ängsten vertraut.
I then went to Berlin, and my doctor, I remember going into the surgery, I'd never met him, and he was blonde, Aryan, wearing a tight white doctor's kind of shirt thing, smoking fags, and I was like, only in Berlin. And he was like, Dan, you're in a real bad place. You have to start taking your medication. He gave me the statistics, my CD4 and viral load. I still didn't have a clue about what they actually meant. It was all kind of like a blizzard in my head. And I went home, checked out what they actually meant, saw that it was so low that I had AIDS. And I collapsed in the shower the next day.
As someone who is fiercely independent, and you're an absolute powerhouse of independence, probably to a point of fault.
Yeah.
What did that feel like for you, that moment that you collapsed and realized I am not independent in this moment?
I mean, it's ultimately about facing your own death and your own morbidity and whether you want to die.
So how did your medication journey begin?
Juliana in Berlin, she's a force of nature. And I met her when I was in Glasgow. She's an activist, and she's a artist, and she has got real grit and a real way to turn rage into something beautiful.
Ganz tief, keine Scham mehr, nur wir.
One of the main reasons why I didn't want to take the medication, I was really scared of the side effects, like really scared of the side effects. Two of them being terror-mares, like really bad nightmares, that you can't sleep. And then your feet turn white, which is might be a bit more of a vanity thing, but I don't want pasty white feet. And she was like, all right, this is what we're going to do. We're going to have a party with all of our mates tonight. We're going to put on real loud, banging, brilliant tunes and scream, terrify each other in each other's faces. And we're all going to paint our feet white. I'm like, you're a lunatic, but I love you. And that's what we did. We all painted our feet white. And screamed in each other's faces and had a really good party. It was such beauty in that. It's like, when you're living with fear, what do? You face it. You have to face it. There's no other way. Like, you either die or you face it and you try and turn it around. The next morning I went to my favourite park in Berlin, Tempelhof, and I took my first pills there with her. And it was such a game changer for me, just swallowing those pills, realising, okay, I've made my choice. And there were no terror-mares, there were no feet going white. And then I quickly, actually I remember it was really quickly that all the physiological effects, the red stuff on my arm, the white stuff on my tongue, went very rapidly. Thierry Schaffhauser is an ACT UP activist from Paris and an amazing sex worker, human rights, pro-Palestine activist, and many other things. He was living in London at the time. We ended up getting together, and I will never forget that and this was again around the time soon after I was on medication. I went round to his and I was like, listen, Thierry, there's something I've got to tell you. I can leave now. I can jump in a taxi. I'm really sorry. He was like, spit it out. What's going on? And I was like, well, I don't know how to say this. He was like, come on. And I said, I'm HIV positive. I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry. And he was like, he literally looked at me and he was like, don't you be so patronizing. It's not your issue to deal with, it's society's. And as a gay man, as a human being on the planet, it's up to us together to deal with HIV. And I'd get your clothes off and get in my bed. And then we had a great time. The next morning he was like, do you know anything about ACT UP? Read this about ACT UP. Watch this about ACT UP. And then I really began to educate myself.
Kein Stigma, kein Urteil hält uns jemals auf. Die Lust nimmt am Schicksal den goldenen Lauf. Zieh den Handschuh aus, spür die Kraft.
And then a few years later, it was 2014, after my lover Thierry had taught me about ACT UP and I went down the rabbit hole, and that was when I really realised it wasn't my issue to deal with, it was society's, and I'm part of this incredible tapestry of change makers and communities who fought tooth and nail for access to medication and to live lives with dignity. At the time in Britain, we were living in a time what was called the second silence. The first silence being in the 80s and 90s, the second silence being around 2014, because of three compounding reasons. Because of the rise in transmission of diagnosis amongst certain populations, because they didn't have access to treatment, because of xenophobia, because of privatisation of the NHS, etc. The second reason being the cuts to education, prevention and support services, because of austerity, because of, again, the privatisation of the NHS. And the third compounding reason being that the general belief that people thought that HIV and AIDS was something of the 80s and 90s. These three reasons together was what was being called the second silence. I contacted Peter Staley, who amazing ACT UP New York activist, the kind of protagonist in the film How to Survive the Plague. Obviously, I fancied him a bit, and I was like, "Are you coming to London anytime?" And he was like, "Actually, I am. I can." And we did a screening of How to Survive a Plague in the basement of what's it called? On opposite Vogue Fabrics, in Vogue Fabrics. And I think around that time, that's when I met Andrea Morden, who a lifelong ACT UP activist. Her life partner, John Morden, rest in power, died of AIDS. He was a pioneering harm reduction drug user activist. And Andrea, for me, was one of my first chosen elders, chosen family, who has taught me so much about how to continue the fight. I owe her so much, and that founding meeting of Peter Staley, when we showed How to Survive a Plague, led to the reformation of ACT UP London.
ACT UP has been a huge part of your adult life. For those who don't know, can you tell us what ACT UP is?
Yes, I will gladly do that. So ACT UP stands for AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. It's a diverse, non-partisan group of individuals united in anger and committed to direct action to end the HIV pandemic, along with the broader inequalities and injustices that perpetuate it. Remembering that HIV and AIDS is foremost a political crisis as well as a medical emergency, we will use every means possible to call out and contain this pandemic. It started in New York in 1987 with a famous speech by Larry Kramer in the LGBT Centre that this is a plague, and what are we all going to do about it? And I think he asked the room to stand up and said, like, now half of you are going to die within a certain amount of time because of AIDS. What are we going to do about it? I've actually just started rereading Larry Kramer's book, Reports from the Holocaust, again about the parallels and the direct connections between what can we learn from other fascist situations, in Larry and my case, like coming from Jewish descendants, well, being Jewish, and how can we apply them today? ACT UP is a fiercely beautiful and brilliant creative direct action movement. Just to give a few examples that still give me the shivers when I think about him, is 1992, the Ashes Action in Washington, when people took the ashes of their murdered loved ones because of government inaction and pharmaceutical greed, in a procession to the White House and threw them over the White House gates to take the war home, to say this is the root cause of where it came from, in an act of grief and rage. And for me, the alchemy of grief is one of the most potent forces that we have in our toolkit. They threw the ashes of their loved ones over the White House gates. And when you see the footage of their speeches, it is absolutely phenomenal. So that was one which really struck me. You can see them all in Sarah Schulman and Jim Hubbard's film, United in Anger. Then, of course, you've got when Peter Staley and some others from ACT UP took a house-shaped condom to Jesse Helms' house, a senator, like a notoriously homophobic and HIV-phobic senator's house, and put a condom on his house when he was out. Brilliant! And when this dickhead came back, literal dickhead, came to his house, Peter Staley and the others were hanging outside his house with a giant condom over it. In ACT UP Paris, obviously you can see it in the film 120 BPM, they put a condom over the obelisk. In London, Andrea and others put a condom over Nelson's column, but they didn't get a picture of it, unfortunately. You know, back then it wasn't the time when people were taking pictures of their breakfasts, let alone the die-ins that have happened, you know, all across the world.
Just stepping in there, to people who are not aware of what ACT UP do, can you explain what a die-in is?
A die-in is where you lie on the ground. It's a vigil, but it's also a protest, because we know that anyone who's killed or who should be here, by default, their death is a protest, or honouring their death is a protest. So you lie on the floor with tombstones, with red ribbons, with red roses, in a significant place. Die-ins have happened outside pharmaceutical companies, outside financial institutions, which are complicit in the rising of the price of drugs. But for us, the last few ones have, since we reformed ACT UP, have been in Trafalgar Square as a homage to the generation above us who were also doing their die-ins in Trafalgar Square. And some of our incredible activists, our elders, were there in the late 80s and early 90s at the die-ins. The commitment of people to come out in the dark, to come out in the cold, to come out in the rain, in the middle of a noisy, polluted roundabout, and lie on the floor blows my mind.
Incredible. And, you know, and I think it's amazing that you did that. I was obviously aware of ACT UP so I'm born in 73, and I knew of ACT UP through a lot of the films I was watching in the 90s, even things like Zero Patience. ACT UP are a big part of that and feature in that, and I've always believed that direct action is very much needed alongside sort of suits and nice dinners and polite conversation and looking at things like Outrage, you know, the amazing direct action that they did, and their knowledge. And I think ACT UP very much have this as well, that knowledge that you need the wow moment.
Yeah.
And now it seems obvious. Now we know that you need the single photograph image that represents it all. But people like ACT UP and people like Outrage realized that years ago. That image of the ashes being thrown over the gates of the White House makes an incredible statement. And watching 120 BPM sort of reignited my interest in ACT UP, and because that's where I first met you. And I would imagine it must be an incredibly intimidating thing to reform such a fantastic organization. But actually, it sounds like for you it wasn't. It sounds like it was just a natural step of something that had to happen.
Yeah, I think, you know, seeing the footage of the meetings in the LGBT Centre in New York, of the fierceness, the vibrancy, the urgency, the joy, the cruising, you know, because I have such a deep need for reconnection because of, as we've talked about, Section 28, let alone my biological ancestry of like complete obliteration because of the Nazi Holocaust. I have a real deep need for community, rebuilding community, as so many of us do. I remember actually the second meeting. There was 4 of us in somewhere in Chinatown, and there was how old was I in 2014? My maths is crap.
Surely 6 years old, Dan.
6 years old. How old was I? It's 2025 now. I'm 42. I was around 30. And there was 2 younger guys there who must have been around 25, and 2 older guys who were coming back to ACT UP. And it was really interesting facilitating that meeting. The 2 younger guys were dealing with chemsex, one of them chemsex, and one of them with early diagnosis, and we're dealing with their own traumas. And one of the older guys said, listen, I don't know what you younger generation have got to deal with. We lost all of our friends. And I was like, hang on a second. This is not the oppression Olympics. It's not a competition of how much trauma we've dealt with. Let's like stop and listen to each other's realities, because we're all part of the same reality, the same symptom of institutional marginalization and oppression against us all. And for me, facilitating intergenerational conversations, how we can learn from each other and learn about our connections and our similarities so that we can move forward in unity is fundamental.
How did you advertise those first ACT UP meetings? I'm fascinated with this idea of you resurrecting this fantastic activist brand. Like, how did you do that?
Great question. Great question. Back then, there wasn't social media, really, I don't think. It was flyers. It was putting posters up around Soho, around Dalston, and having access to venues. And this is the intersection with the importance of places like the Joiners Arms. At the time, we used to meet in Lime Wharf. And we were also campaigning against the closure of queer spaces, because those queer spaces are our places where we have ACT UP meetings. And so space has also always been fundamental to how we can organise.
And why is it important to the community of people living with HIV?
I think the Joiners Arms, not just the fact that it's round the corner from Mildmay, that was my first thought, the Mildmay Hospital, the HIV hospital, who just warms my heart just thinking about them. It's important because space is fundamental to power, and space has been not just like physical spaces, but places where there can be an intersection of the needs of our needs being met. So the Joiners Arms in the evening is obviously a pub, a club, a cabaret space, but in the daytime is a place for HIV testing, is a place for community meetings, for where ACT UP, we can have meetings there. There's always the intersection of these spaces as a nighttime space and a daytime space, and how they can work on in that ecosystem of meeting our needs on every level.
Just this question isn't one of the questions that I was thinking about speaking with you about, but it's a genuine one. ACT UP is a very collegiate organisation, but the truth is that people look to you, and you are very much the energy and inspiration for a lot of those people getting up in, early in the morning, coming to Trafalgar Square at night, lying down in the rain. It's very much your energy that is the inspiration. Thinking back to that frightened Dan getting that diagnosis, getting pissed with his friend just to try to process the news, would you ever have thought that you would make that journey to be such an inspirational leader to the community? And so quickly.
Relatively, yeah, I guess. Oh, bless you, that's so sweet. No, no, didn't have a clue. I didn't know what activism was. I always had a lot of rage. I didn't have any avenues to productively deal with it. It was through listening and meeting incredible people that I kind of mapped it out, and made sense of my grief and the powers of grief. And for me, I really quickly realised that my purpose was about connecting people. There's so much tapestry in our collective action. There's so much incredible tapestry, both intergenerationally, cross-culturally, cross-racially, cross-gender. It's a constant process of weaving our connections, which have all been denied from us.
So jumping back in time then, thinking about Section 28, for someone who now believes that connectivity, believes that community, believes that openness is so important, growing up under Section 28 really must have been incredibly painful. And I'm really struck by something you said in your research notes, a line from Sam Moore. I was never taught how to love or what it might mean for someone like me to feel desire. And by the time I came of age, there was no one left to teach me, which I know is very much about the loss of people. But also, to some extent, I think that also applies to the silencing around Section 28.
Yeah.
And when you talk about how important now community is and how important it is that we reach out to each other, that we know each other's stories, when we are brought up in a system through the school system where those stories are invalidated and silenced, it's just appalling.
It goes so deep. And my housemate, who's going to get up any minute, Sam Arbour, absolute legend, is the director's assistant of Heartstopper, and this I'd explain like the gravity of that quote you just shared. Heartstopper, I'm sure a lot of people have seen it, is such a beautiful documentation. It's a Netflix series about young queer kids in school today. And when it came out, you know, it really like inspired a lot of people. And you know, people say, "Oh, I just binge watch Heartstopper," and I was like, are you kidding me?" I had to stop every 10 minutes and have a cry because the discrepancy of that reality to our lived reality under Section 28 is a parallel universe. There was. You couldn't talk about it. I didn't have any queer friends. There was no teachers to console us at lunchtime. It was violence and abuse and silencing. My two busiest times of the year are World AIDS Day and Holocaust Memorial Day on January the 27th, where I get asked to do a lot of talks. And so my heritage, I'm a grandchild of 4 Nazi Holocaust survivors. And that's obviously where the root of the silence equals death mentality or concept comes from. And the silencing around the traumas that came from my grandparents, let alone the double standards. You know, all we were allowed to talk about is Jewish persecution. But when I realised I was a humongous flaming homosexual, we weren't allowed to talk about homosexuality. So I really noticed from a young age, A, the dangers of silence, and B, how the persecuted can easily become the oppressors if they don't work on their traumas.
You know, it's interesting, Dan. You just reminded me of a time when I went to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and I was in the bookshop having gone around this incredible space. I mean, it was absolutely incredible. And I couldn't find any books on the queer experience in the camps. And when I asked the person at the shop which part of this large bookshop was the queer section, she sort of clutched her pearls and pointed out to me that this was a family
Oh my days.
museum.
Oh my days. I mean, the same. It's so bad. You've got to laugh. Like when I was in Berlin, went to the Holocaust Memorial because 2 of my grandparents are German. Went to the giant Holocaust Memorial, you know, the ones with the big blocks. And I asked the security guy, I was like, where can I find the memorial to the homosexuals? And he was like, oh, it's over there in the bushes. I was like, you've got to be kidding. And it's just one little block. It's beautiful in itself, but it's tucked away in the bushes. And I mean, it's just, it is too much of a stereotype. And what I learned from a young age is what's called the Holocaust hierarchy, about whose story is allowed to be told. And the same kind of hierarchy can be applied to any issue of injustice in the context of HIV. You know, the gay men's story gets told the most. And I'm not, you know, as a gay man, I'm not undermining its importance. But what about women living with HIV? What about people of colour? What about drug users? We constantly have to challenge the hierarchy of what's acceptable. So, you know, our obvious purpose is until there is healthcare for all. So we have to challenge our own stigmas, our own conditioning, and the hierarchies of how history or herstory is allowed to be told.
Absolutely. And it's something that I've really learned making these episodes. I'm really learning, and one of the things I'm learning is how much of my lens through which I look at the HIV story is simply through a gay male perspective. So it's been such a learning curve for me doing this.
Yeah, I mean, you know, more women in the world live with HIV than anyone else. One of the highest rates of diagnosis is heterosexual middle-aged women. If we look at the barriers to trans people having access to healthcare because of the renewed Section 28, the renewed silencing, let alone LGBT and HIV positive migrants who are persecuted under the hostile environment, it's constantly breaking down the walls of everyone who doesn't have access. And that involves doing a lot of unlearning and a lot of ourselves and a lot of dialogue.
So, Dan, I think one of the most fantastic things about you and about a number of my guests is sex positivity. It's something I very strongly believe in. And I know that you do, because when you and I turned up at an event the other day at Goldsmiths College, you arrived, walked up to me and leant into my ear and said, I've just fucked in the toilets. That hot guy over there.
Outrageous. I did, and it was really hot. Me and my lover had a great smooch and the rest in the toilets. And then I said, we're doing this for Mark Ashton because obviously it was on World AIDS Day. Mark Ashton, the legend who was part of Lesbian and Gay Support the Miners and so much more.
Why is sex positivity important, especially within the realm of thinking about yourself living with HIV?
Britain is such a sexually repressed country, and I say that on an institutional level, not on a people level, that it can really lead to dangerous things if you're sexually repressed. So the more spaces that we can create for consensual, liberating sex is really important, which will ultimately lead to the downfall of the British Empire. It's really important because it's about connection, it's about joy, it's about lifting our spirits as well. So that's why having spaces for sexual freedom and sexual exploration on a consensual and beautiful way is liberating.
And now, Dan, something that I think is incredible, and this is something I think very much that ACT UP share with organizations like Outrage, and that is through all of the activism and the very important politics and the grief and the fury, there is always a thread of mischief and humor.
Yes.
Like having attended a number of ACT UP events myself as your photographer, one of your photographers of record, there is always mischief and humor. Why
Yeah.
do you think that's important? Why is that there?
Humor, again, if we're talking about trauma, if we're talking about stress, how do you release it? Creativity is survival, and humor is a key tool of that survival. You know, and it comes as a long line of brilliant communities, like you say, Outrage, which use humor as a way to process grief. Because once you've stared death in the face, once you've really understood the gravity and the breadth of how many people have been murdered and who still should be here, once you've stared at your own morbidity, you have to either laugh or cry. So it's a spiritual release mechanism. And it's also, again, the powers that be, they don't understand humor. It's a key weapon in our toolkit in terms of protest and creating change, because they understand demonstrations. You know, the police walk us from A to B and say, oh, you're allowed this demonstration, like Pride. They don't understand when we dump half a ton of shit on Nigel Farage's UKIP's garage door with a banner which says stop spreading filth, what goes around comes around, solidarity on World AIDS Day, after they said frankly the last kind of migrants we should allow into the UK are those living with HIV. They don't understand how like community cabaret, we did a community cabaret in Nigel Farage's pub in Kent, which was directly inspired by our queer and oppressed ancestors from the Weimar era in Berlin. Another key example of how humor and sex and sassiness and art and performance and music are key weapons for liberation. So we did a what was called the Beyond UKIP cabaret in Nigel Farage's pub, not just with HIV activists like Luca doing HIV anti-stigma classes, but mothers with their boobs out of the bar after UKIP said breastfeeding mothers should face the wall. We had a Mexican migrant solidarity group who did a traffic jam outside around the pub because Nigel Farage blamed traffic on the M4 on migrants. And we had Pat, another queer activist, dancing and singing to It's Raining Men at the front of the pub because UKIP blamed the bad weather when gay marriage was introduced on gays. So we did a parody, we flipped it. And I think it's also like, that's one of, you know, British culture, even though there's a lot of rubbish to deal with, we're brilliant at satire. You know, I would not still be an activist if it wasn't for humour and mischief.
And also joy as well. I mean, you'll fuck off, this is my culture. But
Yes.
if you could explain what that is a little bit, you know, that is when I attended one of those with my camera, there was just so much joy. It was difficult. Not, you know, when you're trying to document something and you're trying to photograph something, you try to stay impartial and just photograph it. But it's impossible not to be just caught up in the smiles of these events. And I thought, fuck off, this is my culture was incredible. If you could explain a bit about what that was.
Yes, I will gladly. Actually, it's more relevant than ever. We've just got an injunction against us. Again, it's a joy as a liberating force, as a connecting force, is not what the state wants. They want us to be sad. They want us to fight with each other. And joy is what connects us. It's about collective joy. And so ACT UP and the Radical Fairies and Queer Tours of London started the Fuck Off, This Is My Culture party the year after George Michael, rest in power, an amazing, obviously, musician, but also HIV advocate, passed away. When he was caught, so he was caught in the toilets in Miami, which led him to make the incredible Outside song, where he turned the toilets into a disco. And he's one of the reasons. I'm actually just staring at his face now on one of our This Is My Culture party posters. You know, he could have just been like, oh, I'm so sorry, cruising bad, I'm just going to deal with that on my own. He was like, you know what, I am gay, I am a faggot, I cruise, I love dick, and I do it in toilets, and I'm going to turn this toilet into a disco. One of the most incredible flips of the press attacks on him, and he turned it into a timeless song. That was the main inspiration for starting This Is My Culture. George, his musicianship, his like not willingness to be smashed down. And so when he was caught cruising by the press chased him in Hampstead Heath, which was one of his favourite cruising grounds. He turned back to them and said, fuck off, this is my culture. Which, you know, I try and look at it, instead of coming out, when we come out as being queer or HIV positive or any challenging stigma, instead of coming out, what do we come into? Flipping it round, we dig deeper. We're like, where has our community come from? What have they done so that we could be here today? And for him to be like, fuck off, this is my culture, is an act of defiance, an act of reclamation, and be like, absolutely not. I'm not going to take your stigma. That was the framing of the Fuck Off, This Is My Culture, which we started by the Factory in Hampstead Heath in 2017. And I remember the first year was so interesting because we had...
Hang on, just before you tell me about the first year, could you just quickly explain what the Factory is?
Oh, yeah, gladly. So the Factory is a tree in Hampstead Heath, which is really easy to fuck on because it's long and low enough down that you can bend over, and if you're a bottom, get fucked on, or if you're a top, fuck someone else over. Very practical, ecological gem. The Factory is also in the woods, and part of it is also about nature connection. Like, how can we not just exist in clubs which take loads of our money, which, you know, have got licensing laws which kick us out at some early hour? How can we reclaim nature and connect with nature to help us continue filling our soul tanks to carry on? And again, it's all part of spirituality and resilience and carrying on. And so we want that. It's kind of our church, that part of Hampstead Heath.
And so what's happened with your legal issue? What's just happened there?
So with the injunction, so we've had This Is My Culture parties now for 9 years. And like you say, Dan, they're full of joy, full of collective joy, both with like music and a fashion catwalk and speeches by our elders, but also people active in various different areas of liberation who speak at the beginning to contextualize the politics of the party. We have giant pinatas every year. We've had one of Thatcher, we've had one of Churchill, we had one of Tesla car this year. You know, obviously it's hilarious because we started it because of George Michael's brilliant statement, fuck off, this is my culture, which comes at the back end of centuries of police entrapment and oppression. We have people fucking in the bushes wearing fake police outfits in honour of the Outside video. But the police are always there. But they've had enough, basically, of our reclaiming our space. Every year we have a theme. We have a song theme and a political theme. This year's song was Somebody to Love. And the political theme was about the closure of queer, trans, HIV and healthcare spaces. The year before, the year before, which is why there were more police there this year, we made it explicitly around Fund Healthcare, Not Warfare, which is a coalition of Palestine Liberation, Jewish Voice for Peace, healthcare and human rights groups. Because we were explicitly pro-Palestinian and had both Palestine activists, queer Palestinian activists, myself as a Jewish pro-Palestine activist speaking, that was no-go for the British state. And so that's why we've got the injunction. Obviously, that's not why they're saying it, but that of course is why they don't want the This Is My Culture party happening, because we're explicitly political and looking at the root cause and the political priorities of this government.
So when I think about ACT UP and how their protest has led to huge change, my understanding is that ACT UP London helped us get PrEP on the NHS. When you look historically at all the incredible things that ACT UP have achieved in terms of using protest as a tool for positive change, do you think that right to protest is being chipped away? And if so, how do you think it will threaten HIV advocacy?
Yeah, great question. I mean, just to amplify, the direct action efficacy, as well as what ACT UP have really taught me about the inside outside strategy, which is direct action activists working on the ground with doctors, nurses, scientists, healthcare workers on the inside. And there's a system of reciprocity. It's not either or. We work together. Sometimes you need to have more direct action, and sometimes you need to be more strategic in other ways. But it's part of a wider theory of change. Without that inside-outside strategy, without the direct actions, we wouldn't have led to generating antiretrovirals in 1996. And I remember, doing the protests around Soho, what we call the queue to nowhere, when we couldn't have access to PrEP, or doing demonstrations outside the Department of Health, just opposite 10 Downing Street, which I think you might have been at, and which was part of the wider movement, which got access to PrEP. Real seismic change making stuff. But I do agree that the chilling effect on the crackdown of protests at the moment is real. Protest is fundamental to our existence, to our humanity, to our ability to make change. But the chilling effect on the Police Crime and Sentencing Act and other government acts is to make it a dirty word, to make it like something which is always too dangerous to do. So we have to constantly reclaim and cherish the fundamental innate importance of protest rather than let it be taken away.
You've written two fantastic books, which I genuinely have really, really enjoyed. That's United Queerdom and Queer Footprints. But you're now writing a third, ACT UP, Rise Up. Can you tell us about that?
Thank you so much. And it means a lot that you've enjoyed the other two books. The first one's called United Queerdom, From the Legends of the Gay Liberation Front to the Queers of Tomorrow. And that's another example of my obsession with the importance of elders. And that was with the founders of Pride, interviews with them. And the second one, Queer Footprints, A Guide to Uncovering London's Fierce History, was... it is a radical queer tour guide, again learning from the ancestors of the streets of London and what stories can we learn. ACT UP, Rise Up is the working title, or Tenderness and Rage, I'm not sure. I'm still working out the kind of framework of it, but again I really realize that the clock is ticking again. It sounds so morbid, of the elders of the HIV activist movement and the wealth of lessons that they have to teach us. We are a bit behind in the UK as opposed to America because of Section 28, of archiving and telling our own stories, because we ain't been allowed to. Thankfully, we've got places like the Bishopsgate Institute, the National Archives, the London Metropolitan Archives, which are absolute epicenters of archives of movements. So basically, it's what is the toolkit of the generation before us, of how they led to such seismic change, and how can we learn from that and carry and hold the torch so that we can complete our goal of healthcare for all. Um, and I want to do it in a way which humanizes, and not just like looking at it strategically, but like what makes these incredible people who face so much injustices get out of the bed in the morning and still stand up and go to meetings and go to events and take risky action. What made them get out of bed in the morning? What's going on in their soul, not just in their like strategic mind, which can be inspiring for the next generation.
My next question applies not just to HIV advocacy, but also generally wider to queer advocacy. What do you think about the argument that you are now fighting in an empty room, that all of our problems were solved once we got the right to gay marriage?
Oh dear. Those people who believe that freedom has been won because of gay marriage really are not. It would be useful to zoom out and look at the bigger picture of everyone on the planet. That would be my first thought of how to respond to that, let alone the fact that like homophobic hate crime, police persecution, LGBT hate crime from the police is very much still a thing. You know, can we all walk down the street and have public displays of queer affection the way that we want to? It might be okay for some part of the LGBTQIA community, but really not for everyone. You know, one thing I was thinking about this morning is the grand picture of homophobia and HIV phobia is as a result of fascism. You know, 4 million people are expected to die by 2030 because they don't have access to medication, because of the cuts to foreign aid. Who decides whose lives are worthy or not?
Now then, Dan, we're coming to the end of the recording now, and this is where I like to take us to a sort of garden of remembrance. And for me, it's always in my head, I'm going to the garden at London Lighthouse, now the Museum of Brands.
Beautiful, yeah.
Which is a space I would highly recommend people visit if they can.
Yeah.
And this is where I'd like to ask you to ask us to take a moment's pause about someone that you would like remembered.
I never knew him. Ray Navarro, who was an ACT UP activist, who dressed up as Jesus outside St. Patrick's Cathedral, where ACT UP New York and some of the other ACT UP chapters did an incredible occupation against the church's lethal homophobic persecution and HIV persecution. I never knew him. I've just seen his face on various films. He died of AIDS really young. And the look on his face, he had such a look of mischief and joy and defiance. He probably knew he was dying, but he dressed up as Jesus and did like vox pops with people in the public outside the cathedral. And and for me, not just he seemed like an incredible human, but he's an illustration of all the like thousands, like so many hundreds of thousands of people who are not with us, who again have their own personality, their own spirit of fire and brilliance. And again, like we were saying, is there's so many people who are part of our community that we have to hold on a deeper level because unfortunately they're not here in person.
Now, Dan, the very final question.
Huh?
If you could write a postcard to the world, what would you write on it?
I would write, friendship is political. Our friends, our chosen family, and your biological family if you're lucky. But our chosen family, our chosen friends who that we can be intimate with, will get us through all the crises and the barriers and the bullshit that we might face in the world. And my friends, like I've mentioned, a few of them mean everything to me. Not in a kind of dry way, but in a beautiful, joyful, mischief-making way as well.
Dan Glass, author, activist, and all-round mischief maker. This
Thanks,
interview has been everything that I hoped it would be. Thank you so much for appearing on this final episode of Series 2 of HIV The Morning After.
Oh, bless you, Dan. Thank you, love.
If you were moved or informed by what you heard today, please help spread the word. Subscribe to HIV The Morning After and leave a rating and a review. It makes a huge difference in helping others to find it. Your support helps to amplify these experiences. If you'd like to get in touch, suggest a guest, or share your own thoughts, you can email me at hivthemorningafter@gmail.com. And remember, if you encounter HIV stigma in a bar, call it out. If you encounter it at work, call it out. If you encounter it online, call it out. Because if you don't, you're part of the problem. The theme tune is by Pauline Nidu at unstoppablemonsters.com. And many thanks to Murray Lang for his continued support. And thank you for listening. Join me next time for another important conversation on HIV The Morning After. I've been Dan Hall.